Good day, everyone. This is a new 13-part series in which we will delve into the different combinations of what we call derivative houses. So if you have ever visited an astrologer, you may have questions about your family. This can be your father, mother, or siblings, and obtained some kind of responses despite the fact that the astrologer had no knowledge of your family members' natal charts. And did you ever wonder how this was even possible in the first place? And if we think about it, the concept of houses, which symbolizes many aspects of life and personality qualities, is actually one of the most fundamental principles in astrology. However, this is or should I say, there is a lesser known but equally significant concept. And that's what we are exploring in this 13-part series, which is called derivative houses. And this approach basically allows you to see the people in your life who are important to you in your chart, which can reveal vital insights on their personality in life as well as a result. And we'll look at how derivative houses work in astrology, how they're calculated, and what they might tell us about ourselves and the people we care about. And we will also show within this series how to apply derivative houses in your own astrological practice. Insights into derivative houses may help you to obtain a better insight of yourself and the world around you, whether you are a seasoned astrologer or otherwise. Although it appears to be based on an older work attributed to Asclepius, I think that's how it's pronounced, Asclepius, the first use of derivative houses and the employment of it was actually done in the work within the 2nd century. And that's by astrologer Vaticus Valens. And this method has been employed in several astrological traditions throughout the centuries. And if you don't have a birth date of a significant person in your life, or if you want a different viewpoint of their effect, I would actually recommend that the usage of derivative houses might be useful. And at least for me, I would say that the technique of using derivative houses, I often use it when dealing with horary-related questions. And I also employ derivative houses, the concept of it, in predictive techniques such as when I use profections. That really comes in handy. And I must also mention that on a humorous side, when my astrological tutor, when I was studying astrology actually, he used to ask me exactly how many houses are there. And I always give 3 answers, 3 separate distinct answers. 4 houses, 12 houses, and 144 houses. Now let me explain why. When we talk about why there's 4 houses, the 4 houses, basically what I'm referring to are the 4 angles of the chart, and those represent the main goals of life. So starting from the 1st house, which is about me or the path that I take, spilling over to the 7th house, which can mean relationships and partnerships. It can also mean the external factors that's influencing the path that you are undertaking, or the engagements with the external world that you need to make things happen in accordance to your wishes, which is the 1st house. So you can see how 1st and 7th house are actually very interlinked that way. And if we actually go towards the 4th house, the 4th house is basically sharing of a home. It also governs roots and foundations. And the opposite of the fourth house is the 10th house, which talks about the future or any aspirations that you have that you want to achieve in the world. And that's the 10th house. So for the next point, why do I say there's 12 houses as one of my answers? It's pretty evident because we do have 12 houses that's displayed here. So this sums up the 12 main spheres of life and their own unique individual meanings. And last but not least, why 144? Now, this actually brings in the derivative houses. And that's because if we actually point to any one of the houses, there's actually 12 other combinations that may result in that house in the end. So if you multiply 12 other meanings for each of the 12 houses, 12 times 12 is 144. So for the next little bit, let me just go through in brief what the 12 houses can be about. So let's start off with the first house. And the first house basically reveals information about the person whose chart we are reading. But in other instances, the first house can also mean the birth of something. It also describes the self, the appearance of it. And first house also represents the mask that we are wearing as well. And it also may describe how do we self-express. What's the natural instincts that enabled us to self-express in a certain particular way. First house can also mean new beginnings as well. And first house can also mean first impressions when we meet someone. And it also can describe our effect on other people as well. And the first house, last but not least, it can also be talking about how we perceive the world. And this actually influences that the path that we may choose to take instinctively. So now let's quickly move on to the second house. The second house here can represent money, values, security, self-worth, innate wealth. It can also describe possessions as well. We can also describe our object attachments. And last but not least, it can also be talking about personal resources as well. Our gifts and talents may also fall under the second house. And now let's quickly move on to the third house. Third house is the first house that talks about communications, particularly the language that we use. And it can also be relating to how relatable we are, because it's the first of the social houses, and that's the Gemini house, the third house. And the third house can also be referring to logic and reason. This can also be talking about the mental ego as well within all of us. And the third house is one of the houses of logic, but this actually talks about the concrete mind, how we visualize with our five senses in particular. And third house can also be talking about our siblings and cousins. And it can also talk about our other relatives as well, which are mainly our aunties and uncles. And the third house, since it's a house of learning, it can also talk about our early school environment. And of course, it also talks about all forms of communication. Third house can also talk about our neighbors as well. And the third house can also be talking about short traveled journeys. So in other words, local transportation. And it can also be a house where it exhibits our ability to express ourselves and also describe our intellect. I'll just like to go back to the point regarding the third house describing our siblings, because this house tells us about them in general. But I would say that the third house basically represents your elder sibling. And if you're the eldest yourself, this may describe the one that is immediately after you. And if we actually want to look at the sibling constellation down the line, the next immediate sibling will be the third house. this depends whether you're the oldest in the pecking order or not. And then the sibling after that will be 3 houses away from the third. So it's 3, 4, 5. So it's the fifth house describing the next sibling. And then the immediate sibling that's after that one is 3 houses away from the fifth. So it's 5th, 6th, 7th. So you can see how that 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, so on and so forth. This will describe each sibling in their unique flavor and tapestry. So now let's move on to the 4th house. And 4th house is really talking about our home, our family, our roots. And this can also describe some kind of endings and beginnings as well, because it's the lowest part of the chart. And I will go on to say that the 4th house, because it's one of the parental axes, this actually may describe the father figure, because the 4th house is where we actually inherit some form of identity from a parent. And since most of us, at least for a large percentage in this case, most of us carry our dad's surname. So that's why I actually attribute the 4th house as more of referring to the dad figure growing up. But of course, now with like many people growing up in single parent households, or if some are even growing up in same-sex couple households. So the 4th and 10th house, the opposite house, the implications or who resemble who in what house, this is getting more fluid actually. So just keep this in mind. And so on top of that, the 4th house can also be, besides home, family, origins, is also one of the meanings of the 4th house. It also talks about our roots. It talks about our most private life that we most likely do not share with other people. And the 4th house can also represent our early home life as well. It also can represent our early conditionings growing up. It also can represent our inner base of operation. That's also one of the more traditional meanings of the 4th house. And last but not least, like what I just mentioned, is the influence of the father. I would more likely attribute it, or this can be the influence of a parent who swings in more to teach you more about the world at large. So now let's move on to the next one, which is the 5th house, a Leo house. And this house can govern our romantic relationships and the birth of our first child. And just like how we derive siblings as per the 3rd house, if we want to look at the second child, it will be the sibling to the first child. So we actually count again 3 houses away from the 5th. So the second child will be represented by the 7th house. And then the 3rd child is the sibling to the second child, second born child, that is. And we will count 3 houses from the 7th, and we end up with the 9th house, so on and so forth. And but the base meaning of the 5th house, it can really represent like hobbies, play, how you experience joy in your life. For example, it can also describe our romantic life and love affairs that's connected to that. And 5th house also connects to our inner child as well. It overall represents our children and our baby. But when I say our baby, it does not only mean physical child in this case. When I actually say our baby, it also can represent the enterprise that we operate. So the enterprises that we run ourselves, the one that we are the true boss of it, because that's also called our baby, because it's our creative endeavors, which actually falls under the 5th house as well. And 5th house can also be anything that you do for fun, for leisure. So that includes anything that deals with sports and hobbies. That's very Leo-like in terms of meaning. And this may also describe what do we do to fulfill our urge to be special. And one of the other meanings that come up will be the urge to produce or procreate. It also falls under the fifth house, and hence creative endeavors and the enterprises that we are the true bosses of falls under the fifth house. It may also describe your own sense of creative self-expression, and also may represent the urge to influence as well, because the fifth house is one of the houses that I look at when we talk about someone who's very, at least on a vocational profile-wise, someone who is very great at communications. So I look into the fifth house as one of the houses. And last but not least, the fifth house can also be what do you do to escape from responsibilities? And this may tie in with what you do under your downtime. And so now let's move on to the sixth house. The sixth house will be the Virgo house. And this house is actually more concerned with our workplace and also our co-workers as well. And other meanings of the sixth house can mean how do we tackle chores in our life? Our daily rituals fall under the sixth house. So this can also be what we do in our mundane regularity. Sixth house is also one of the houses of the apprentice. So something that's dealing with craftsmanship and perfection of that skill falls under the sixth house as well. And sixth house is also one of the houses that talks about health matters and issues. And it also describes our mundane reality as well. Sixth house is also one of the houses of unequal relationships, because 6, 8, and 12 are what I call the darker houses, and sixth house is basically the first one. And like I mentioned before, the sixth house can also mean the workplace and also co-workers. How do you experience them? And it may also describe those themes as well. And the next thing will be your proficiency. Besides perfection, it also falls under the sixth house because of the apprenticeship connection. And it also talks about mind-body connection as well, because it's a Virgo-related house. So anything, what do you do to put yourself back into balance? And that's what mind-body connection is about. And the sixth house can also be talking about the necessity of boundaries. So if you've got a very weak sixth house, or the sixth house ruler is very badly aspected, this can actually give me an indicator of whether you operate towards what spectrum in terms of boundaries in your relationships. Are you more of like a doormat kind of person, or do you have very healthy boundaries that's not to be messed with? So sixth house is one of the main houses I look into. And sixth house, the last meaning I can think of will be talking about servants, hired help, and also employees in which you may have. And so now let's move on to the upper half of the chart, starting off with the seventh house. The seventh house can represent our committed partnerships, so it can represent spouses in general. And but more importantly, this actually describes the first committed partnership. And people have asked me before, so what about for someone who's married several times? I basically use derivative houses to find out. So if the seventh house describes our first committed partner, if we actually get divorced or legally, get legally done with that relationship, I usually count 9 houses away from the 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I end up with the 3rd house. This will be the phase in your life in which you are free from your first marriage partner as a single person, technically and legally. And 9 houses away from the 7 takes care of that legality of things in terms of proceedings. And so if you actually get married to a second committed partner, then you will count 7 houses away from the 3rd. And this is how we end up with the 9th. And if we actually get divorced from our second marriage partner, I will count 9 houses from the 9th house. So I will end up with the 5th. So the 5th house basically represents you being single from your second committed partner or marriage partner. And if you marry for the 3rd time legally or by civil partnership whatsoever, you will count 7 houses away from the 5th. And that's how we end up with the 11th house cusp as your 3rd marriage partner. And I will read the 11th house, what planets are in it, and also the ruler of the 11th house, how is it placed, so on and so forth. It can actually give quite a good picture of that person energetically and what's around he or she, by the way. So the first marriage partner is the 7th, the second one is the 9th, the 3rd marriage partner is the 11th, so the 4th will be the ascendant or the 1st house, so on and so forth. And the 7th house, if I were to think about other meanings of it, it can also be what we project onto other people. It also can be represented by the 7th house. So besides committed relationships and a marriage partner in which I just mentioned, it can also be describing how do we care for others and show concern for others. That's also the 7th house. And it can also be the house of socialization of it all. It can also be mutual commitments. And it can be a house that is actually describing lawsuits as well. Because the 7th house is when, it's one of the houses that traditionally describes open enemies. And we usually meet our open enemies, in court. That's one of the meanings. And so this can be like lawsuits that's thrown our way. So that can be the 7th house. So now let's move on to the 8th house, which is a Scorpio-related house. This is one of the resource houses. And 8th house can also mean, or it governs inheritance, bank credits, and it may also describe potentially fatal situations as well. 8th house is one of the houses that talk about crises in general. On top of that, it also talks about other people's money, your partner's values. This meaning tied to the 8th house, which is partner's values, is also derived via derivative houses because it's the 2nd house from the 7th. If the 7th house describes the physicality of our partner, then the 2nd house from the 7th describes our partner's values. So that means the 8th house. The 8th house can also represent taxes, loans, and banks, and our dealings with them. 8th house is also how we merge with another person because of that Scorpio connection, the urge to merge, meaning. And it may also describe how do we self-regenerate. 8th house is also one of the houses that talks about transformations and renewal. It can also be referring to death and also sex. When I say sex here, it can mean that intimacy portion of sex. It's not just the sex that we do for fun and just, be like a throwaway. 8th house is that serious form of like serious form of intimacy, what we describe it as intimate sex, that is. Because eighth house to me is got that trust factor. And in order to give yourself to another that deeply, is to be intimate. Because eighth house is also one of the houses that make us feel kind of vulnerable. And it can also be one of the houses that that may also describe if we have the energy predisposition to attract psychic vampires as well. Because when I think about the eighth house, it has to do with someone who actually sucks out energy dry energetically. And this can be also financially as well, because it's one of the financial houses. And so when we talk about someone who's got a lot of encounters with people that psychically attaches to them and just feed on their energies, I will actually look into their eighth house for that idea of whether this is true or not. So now let's move on to the ninth house, which is a Sagittarius kind of house. It may describe long distance exploration, journeys of the mind. It can also represent how attuned are we to collective thought. It can also be talking about the higher mind, and also whether we will have the chance to participate in higher education, because ninth house can represent universities as a place. Ninth house on a broader term can mean adult education as well. How much we value it and go for it and seek it to actually broaden our perceptions. Ninth house is also one of the houses that talks about whether someone's a very good teacher, a mentor. Ninth house is also one of the houses that I look at for someone who wants to be an astrologer as well. It's the divinity aspect of the ninth house, and it's also one of the houses of communication, and hence is linked to whether someone is suitable to become an astrologer in a consulting role, in a counseling role. And ninth house is also one of the houses of publishing. And ninth house is also the house of purpose and truths as well. Ninth house is also the part of the chart that crosses international borders, particularly the ninth house cusp. So it can also rule foreign travels. If the third house is talking about short travel journeys, then the ninth house, which is the opposite house, it talks about far traveled journeys. That means across international borders. And now let's look at the 10th house. The 10th house basically governs one's career and vocation. And it also talks about the influence of the mother, because we talked about the fourth house as the house that's mainly talk about the influence of the father figure. So the 10th house here, the opposite house will be talking about the influence of the maternal figure or the motherly figure, so to speak. And the 10th house is also how enmeshed are we with the need for achievement. There's also the 10th house. And with that, how hungry are we for recognition and validation from the outer world, the 10th house. 10th house can also represent our social status. It also represents our public life. It also represents our attitude towards authority figures and the relationship surrounding that. And 10th house, last but not least, talks about ambitions as well. One of the other meanings that I found lately with a client, because that client has got a 10th house stellium, this actually is a bit of spilling into the next house, the 11th house, because that client is perpetually being unhappy with the kinds of relationships that he has. And the main relationship that he has up to thus far are mostly falling under the friends with benefits kind of relationships. And he's always been kind of being misunderstood by them, or they are actually, in retrospect, he sees them as his secret enemies. So the 10th house is basically 12 houses away from the 11th. Anything that's 12 houses away means that there's a chance of being misunderstood. And anything that's 12 houses from itself, it also represents secret enemies as well. And since the house that we start counting from is the 11th house, 11th house is the house of friends with benefits. So some interesting tidbits regarding that. And now let's move on to the 11th house. So 11th house, like I mentioned before, it talks about friends with benefits, but it also can talk about our friendship circle and the groups that we network with. And 11th house can also be talking about our future hopes and dreams. It's also one of the wealth-related houses, by the way, because it's the second from the 10th. So it's the money that we get from our ambitions, our public life, our social status, and the accompanying recognitions. And so the 11th house can be the tangible stuff that we get from our career that goes into our pocket or bank account. The 11th house, in other meanings, can also be how well are you attuned to the currents in the atmosphere or in the air, because it's the house of Aquarius. It can also represent the groups and organizations that we engage with or mingle with. It can also represent how much do we group think. It represents the hive mind, hive as in beehive, because it's the house of groups. And because it's got the Aquarius connection, which is an air sign, so it's related to that aspect of things. It may also describe our role in groups. It may also describe how well are we attuned to the social reforms that's going on in the larger part of society. And 11th house, of course, it represents like friendship circle, like I mentioned before, but it also represents friends with benefits. And 11th house can also represent trends. How well are you attuned to the trends of society? Or how interested are you in that? So with that, we come to the last of the 12 houses, which is the 12th house. And the 12th house basically reveals our secrets and ailments. And it may also indicate clandestine or secretive associations as well. Other meanings of the 12th house can be talking about how well are you attuned to the collective unconsciousness. It talks about your level of compassion and empathy for other people. It also talks about meditation and also prayer. So for people who are very much into that, there may be a very well-emphasized 12th house energy in your chart. 12th house is also talking about drugs, alcohol, and also escape, because it's the house of transcendence where we want to just leave the world behind and be our own little bubble or cocoon. 12th house, as I mentioned before, it can also talk about hidden enemies. It can also about how your unconscious operates. And 12th house can be also one of those psychic houses as well. Just to be clear, 12th house can also represent the womb. So in other words, this can describe the hours leading to our birth, because the 12th house, the next house will be the first house, which describes our body at the moment of birth. So the 12th house can also represent the environment leading to our birth. In the last few hours prior to us taking our first breath. And 12th house can also represent sacrifices that we make in our lives. How prone are we to make them? And the 12th house can also represent our karma as well. So for the last part of this introduction to the other meanings of the 12 houses using the derivative houses technique, let me just grab one of the houses as an example of how the next 12 episodes will operate. So you can have a better idea of what we are talking about, at least from a terminology perspective. So if we actually, for example, let me choose the 4th house in this case. The 4th house is the first from the 4th house. So the first represent the house number. From the 4th house represent the area of concern. Okay? And so what is the resultant here? The first from something represents the personal description or characteristics of something. From the 4th house can mean base of operations. So the resultant meaning will be the personal base of operations. The first from the 4th house. Okay? But the 4th house can also be the second from the 3rd house. If we move backwards, okay? I'll just give like a very brief thing going around the circle with the resultant house as the 4th to give some examples. So if my mouse is on the 3rd house, it's the second from the 3rd house. Anything that's second from itself means the resources. From the 3rd house, this can be something of the mind. So if I combine second from the 3rd house, which results in the 4th house as resultant one, this represents resources of the mind. This can be memory or habits or all those related stuff. But then the 4th house can also be the 3rd from the 2nd house. So it's 3 houses away from the 2nd. That's how we end up with the 4th. And anything that's 3rd from itself, it can represent or describe the environment of something. And then the 2nd house can represent one's possessions. So when I put the meanings together, the 3rd from the 2nd, this can mean the environment of one's possessions. Okay? So move one back even more. So the 1st house is 4 houses away to the 4th. So it's 4th from the 1st house. So anything that's the 4th can represent the home. From the 1st house means something that's of itself. So the 4th from the 1st, which results in the 4th house, if we were to come from the 1st house, this can describe the home's appearance itself. Okay? Now let's move one house back even more. So the 12th house is 5 houses away from the 4th. So anything that's 5th or 5 houses away, this can represent self-expression. And the 12th house can be something that's clandestine or behind the scenes. So when it's 5 houses away from the 12th, it also ends up with the 4th house. This can also represent the self-expression behind the scenes. 5th from the 12th house, okay? And so now let's look at the 11th house. The 11th house is 6 houses from the 4th. So anything that is 6 houses away means that's a serving kind of energy. It's got a Virgo kind of serving energy from the 11th house, friendship circle, friends with benefits. So the 4th house, which is the 6th from the 11th house, can represent that which serves your friends. So now let's move on to the 10th house, which is the 7th from the 10th house. That's how we end up with the 4th house. So anything that is the 7th away from something, this can be the complement to something. And since we're counting from the 10th house, this can infer someone's vocation or career. So the 4th house can also mean the complement of the career, because it's 7 houses away from the 10th. And now let's move back 1 house backward even more. So the 4th house is 8 houses away from the 9th, or the 8th from the 9th. That's how we end up with the 4th as well. Anything that's 8th from itself, that's the energy of investment. From the 9th can be purpose or plans. That's 2 of the meanings of the 9th house. So the 4th, it may be a result of 8 houses away from the 9th, if we count 8 houses from the 9th house cusp. So this may also represent the 4th house, which is here, also represents the investment into your plans and purpose as well. That's also represented by the 4th house. And moving on, if we actually count from the 8th house, we need to count 9 houses away from the 8th house cusp to end up with the 4th house cusp. So anything that's 9 from itself, it can represent purpose. Because we counted from the 8th house cusp, 8th house can be one of the houses of expenditure. So the 4th house equals 9 houses away from the 8th. So this can mean the purpose of expenditures as well. If we look from the 8th house perspective, that's 9 houses away to the 4th. And if we look at the 7th house over here, is 10 houses away from the 7th. That's how we end up with the 4th house cusp. Anything that is 10 houses away from itself is the career of something. And the 7th house represents looking after or caring for a partner. So the 4th house, which is a derivative of 10 houses away from the 7th, another meaning of the 4th house, if we look from this house's perspective, will be the career of looking after a partner. This can be one of the meanings. And if we actually move 1 house backwards even more to the 6th house cusp, how many houses is the 6th house away from the 4th if we count in this direction? It is 11 houses away from the 6th house. So anything that's 11 houses away, this may also describe the sphere of influence of something. And since we are counting from the 6th house, 6th house can represent something that your work produces, something tangible, because it's a Virgo house. So if I were to combine 11 houses away from the 6th, which results in the 4th house, this will add another meaning to the 4th house, which represents the sphere of influence produced by your work. Okay, that's one of the other meanings. And last but not least, if we actually look at the 5th house cusp, it is 12 houses away from the 5th. That's how we end up with the 4th house, because it's 1 house behind 4th. If we compare the location of 5th and 4th house. So the 4th house is 12 houses away from the 5th. Anything that is 12 houses away means it can also describe subjective factors as well. Since we're counting from the 5th house cusp, this can be something that affects our offspring or our creative endeavors. And so the 4th house, if we count from the 5th, which is 12 houses away, this can represent the subjective factors that's affecting our creative endeavors or offspring or children in this case as well. So you can see how we actually go around the house and derive 12 other meanings of the fourth house. But in this case, I'm only doing something that's very condensed. So in the future 12 other episodes, we will just focus on one house and go around the zodiac, and we will attempt to uncover the 144 meanings of the 12 houses. So if that makes sense, do give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe, and I'll be getting perhaps some of my fellow astrologers to come in for certain houses. And this will be like a brainstorm kind of video coming up for the next 12 episodes. So stay tuned, and yeah, we'll see you here then.